A tranquil arc, Chronicles' presence, smiling in the fog, prologue. A whisper over the dunes, good evening, and welcome back to Tranquil Arc Chronicles, endless horrories for sleepless nights. Tonight, as the clock sighs toward midnight and the world softens into quiet, let your eyes rest upon the unseen horizon. Imagine a shoreline where waves crawl like slow-breathing things, and the mist seems to have memory. The air there tastes not of salt, but of something older, something that once tried to speak. That place was once called Grayhaven, a small, forgotten English town along the northeastern coast, sometime around 1847. A harbor of fishermen and cobblers, of widows who spoke to portraits, and of one man who always smiled. If you listen closely, beneath the hum of your room, you may still hear the faint chime of the bell tower that hasn't rung in 100 years. It rings only when the fog returns. So, close your eyes. Let the air grow pale and damp around you. And when you open them again, we begin. Chapter 1, The Stranger by the Shore. The first time anyone saw him, the tide had just turned. It was May 3rd, 1847, and the sea was dressed in fog so thick that even the lighthouse beam stumbled through it. Old Silas Crow, keeper of Grayhaven Light, stood on the catwalk, lantern in hand, writing in his log with deliberate slowness, a habit that made him feel safe when the fog crept in. The logbook was a relic of discipline and sanity. Every night entry marked his survival. Dense fog since dawn, he wrote. No ships seen, bells muffled. Heard footsteps below at 11:42. No one reported ashore. He paused. The quill dripped once, dotting the parchment like a tear. There was no path below, only dunes, salt grass, and the skeletal outline of the old pier, the one swallowed by the sea 2 winters ago. And yet the footsteps continued, a soft, even rhythm coming closer. Silas peered down through the haze. There, between the tattered curtains of mist, stood a man, tall, thin, coat flapping like wings in the wind. He was facing the shore, not the sea, his head tilted slightly, as if listening. Then he smiled, not wide, not grotesque, just a calm, knowing smile, the kind you might expect from a man who'd already seen everything. Silas called out, no answer. The smile didn't move. He turned the light toward the figure, and for a moment, the beam cut the fog enough to reveal a pale, waxen face. The eyes were open, but unfocused, as if looking through the world, not at it. Then the fog closed again, and the man was gone. In the morning, Silas tried to speak of it at the Anchor's Rest, Grayhaven's only tavern. But the townsfolk only chuckled. The old keeper had seen too much weather and too little company. Still, that night, the log entry was there, his handwriting steady. Returned at midnight, smiling, watching, and under it a second line appeared, not written by Silas. Same ink, different hand. He always watches. Silas swore he never wrote it, but after that night, he never stayed past midnight again. The fog did not lift that week. The fishermen's boats came back half-laden and half-wrecked, and every evening someone would glance toward the dunes and think, someone's there. The baker swore he saw a man smiling at him through the oven window. The priest said a grin formed on the crucifix when he prayed alone. A mother claimed her child laughed in his sleep and whispered, "He's here again." By the week's end, Grayhaven began closing its shutters before sundown. The second witness, her name was Eleanor Cray, a painter who'd moved from London after her husband's death. She lived at the edge of town, where fog licked the cliffs like a patient animal. Eleanor painted the sea because she couldn't bear to paint faces anymore. Every portrait she ever loved had become a gravestone. On May 11th, she decided to capture the fog. She set her easel outside her cottage, wrapped in shawls, her brush trembling slightly in the cold. As she mixed the gray-blue tones, she felt watched, not near distant, like a presence patiently waiting for her to turn. And when she finally did, her brush fell from her hand. There he was, on the shore, smiling. The same man Silas described, tall, pale coat, dark as soaked ink. And yet, something about him felt impossibly still, like the air refused to move around him. Eleanor blinked once. He was gone. But when she returned to her canvas, she froze. She hadn't painted him, yet he was there, faintly, among the fog strokes. A shape, a face, a smile. The fog deepens over the next week's Grayhaven began changing. People forgot conversations they'd just had. Mirrors misted from within. Dogs barked at empty corners. And then came the dreams. At first, it was laughter, distant, then faces forming in the vapor, and finally, the smile, that calm, soft, deathless smile that lingered behind their eyelids. By June, 7 people had vanished. No struggle, no traces, just doors left open, beds cold, and one thing always the same. On the window pane, drawn in condensation, a curved line and 2 dots. The investigation begins. London newspapers finally sent a correspondent, Thomas Wren, a young journalist known for his obsession with moral madness, a new term whispered among early alienists. He arrived in Grayhaven by train on June 29th. The conductor warned him, "You'll find more fog than news there, sir." He was right. When Thomas stepped off the platform, the fog swallowed him whole. The lamps above seemed dimmer than candles, and the air carried the faintest scent of burnt sugar, sweet, wrong, clinging. A woman at the inn handed him his key with a trembling hand. "You're here for the smiles, aren't you?" He didn't answer. That night, he dreamt of the sea laughing. End of chapter 1. Chapter 2: The Portraits That Grin Back Endless Histories for Sleepless Nights. The next morning, the fog hung lower than ever before, not drifting, but sinking. It rolled down chimneys, seeped beneath doors, coiled around ankles, as if claiming the ground it once owned. Grayhaven awoke not to sunlight, but to a dim silver blur. No gulls cried, no carts rolled. Even the church bell seemed reluctant to move. Thomas Wren, half awake and chilled, stepped out of his inn with his notebook in hand. He had expected stories of hysteria, an overexcited coastal town plagued by superstition. But now, walking through those narrow lanes, he realized something different. The silence had shape. It was not empty, it listened. Eleanor's canvas. He found Eleanor Cray in her cottage by the cliffs, a low stone dwelling with ivy choking its chimney and salt crusted on its window panes. The door was ajar. Inside, the air smelled of turpentine, seawater, and something faintly metallic. "Mrs. Cray," Thomas called softly. A voice answered from the adjoining room. "Come in, but don't look too quickly." He stepped through the narrow hall. The walls were lined with portraits, dozens of them, of fishermen, widows, children, sailors, all local faces, painted in melancholy tones. But what caught him wasn't their sadness, it was their smiles. Every single painting, no matter how somber the subject, bore the same faint curl at the lips, the same knowing, secretive expression. Thomas stopped, his throat tightened. "Were they always?" he began. "No," she said flatly. "I never painted them smiling." She came into view, a gaunt woman in her late 30s, eyes hollow from sleeplessness. Her brush hand trembled as she gestured toward the largest canvas, still wet with oil. It was a new painting, a man standing at the edge of the shore, half consumed by fog. She hadn't touched the mouth yet, but even so, the lips seemed to twist slightly upward, as if anticipating the next stroke. "Do you see it?" she asked. Thomas nodded. "May I ask when this began?" She laughed weakly. "When I tried to paint the fog itself, it moved. It answered the brush." Her voice lowered. "He visits, you know, at night. Not inside, not yet, but close enough that I can hear his breath fog the glass." The lighthouse log. Thomas spent the next day tracing local accounts. He met old Silas Crow at the lighthouse, the one who'd first seen the man. Silas was pale, frail, and blind in one eye. When Thomas asked about the fog, Silas only said, "It's not weather, boy, it's a mouth. The town's been swallowed, and we just haven't hit the throat yet." He handed Thomas a folded paper from his logbook, something he'd torn out after the second sighting. On it was written in unsteady letters, "The smile grows. Even the waves curl upward like lips. The fog breathes." Thomas pocketed the paper, uneasy. A town of masks that evening. Grayhaven seemed different. He noticed people turning away as he passed, not rudely, but cautiously. as though hiding something on their faces. Children were not playing. Instead, they sat by doorways, humming tunelessly and tracing circles in the dust. The innkeeper, Mrs. Tilbury, served him dinner with her back turned. "Ma'am," he asked, "why won't anyone look at me?" Her voice cracked. "Because we don't know who smiles anymore." Later that night, unable to sleep, Thomas crept down to the parlor, where a cracked mirror hung by the hearth. The room was empty. Yet, as he stared at his reflection, a faint line appeared near the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, but the idea of one. He pressed his lips flat. The reflection didn't. It kept smiling. He stepped back, heart racing, and the glass fogged from the inside. The painter's end the next morning. The fog was worse, heavy as wool, thick as milk. Thomas hurried back to Eleanor's cottage to find the door swinging open. The smell of oil and salt was overwhelming. Inside, all her paintings had been turned to face the walls, every last one except for the largest, propped near the window. The man in the fog now smiled fully, and standing beside him on the canvas was Eleanor herself, brush in hand, mouth curled in the same unnatural expression. Thomas's breath caught. He stepped closer, reaching for the frame, and that's when he saw it. Inside the painting, the fog was moving, not metaphorically, literally. Brushstrokes shifted like ripples, her painted eyes glistening wetly. He stumbled back, knocking over a stool. When he turned toward the open door, he froze. A silhouette stood at the edge of the cliff, where the sea hissed in gray light, tall, thin, still, and smiling. When Thomas blinked, both the figure and the painting were gone. Only the easel remained, and a faint outline of two figures pressed against the canvas, like hands beneath a shroud. That night, he made another note in his journal. The fog is not a phenomenon, it is a contagion of perception. The smile is its symptom. But later, when he reviewed the page, a second line had appeared below his writing, and you have breathed it too. Chapter 3, Dreams in the Gaslight, Endless Histories for Sleepless Nights. Grayhaven had begun to rot from the inside out. By July 2nd, 1847, the fog had swallowed not only the harbor and the cliffs, but the minds of those who remained. No ship dared to dock anymore. The last vessel that tried the Aegis vanished to miles off the coast. Only its bell drifted back on the tide, tolling faintly, though no hand rang it. The mainland papers had stopped printing reports. London believed Grayhaven quarantined for maritime cholera. No one realized that the disease was not of the body, but of the dreams. The night whispers. At first, the dreams came as whispers. Children muttering in their sleep. Old men giggling softly into their pillows. Mothers waking to find their husbands smiling in the dark, eyes open, breath steady, as if something inside them found joy where it shouldn't, and always. When they tried to recall what they had dreamt, they could only say, "He was there." That was enough. Everyone knew who they meant. Thomas's journal. Thomas Wren, still in the fog, choked in pod, began recording his own sleep patterns for the London Courier, intending to expose Grayhaven's psychological infection. He wrote every night before the lamps dimmed. Day 12. No change in fog density. Mild dizziness after sundown. Locals increasingly unresponsive to conversation. Hypothesis, collective hysteria. But on the 13th night, his entry changed tone. I dreamt of the pier. The fog spoke my name. A shape smiled where my shadow should be. When he awoke, his pillow was damp with salt water. The doctor's house word reached him that a physician, Dr. Aldous Penryn, was conducting his own study of the phenomenon. Penryn was a nervous man with spectacles perpetually fogged and ink stains on every finger. His clinic smelled of ether and mildew. Have you dreamt of him yet? The doctor asked as Thomas entered. I've dreamt something, Thomas admitted, and Wren nodded gravely. Then you've already met him. He led Thomas to a small room lined with cots. On each lay a patient, 10 in total, sleeping soundly, all with identical half-smiles on their faces. Their eyes fluttered beneath closed lids, as though watching the same scene unfold. I call it the Grayhaven somnia, Penryn said. The dreams link them like a shared mind, a fog of thought. Once you smile in your sleep, you belong to him. He held up a mirror before one of the sleeping patients. The reflection showed not a resting face, but a grinning one, teeth bared, eyes open. Then, as both men watched, the reflection blinked. The minister's despair, the town's minister, Reverend Abner Locke, had stopped ringing the church bell weeks ago. He now sat in the pews each evening, staring at the altar as if expecting it to speak. Thomas found him there one night, lit only by flickering gaslight. Reverend, he asked quietly, do you know what the smile means? Locke didn't answer at first. His hand trembled on the Bible. Finally, he whispered, it's a covenant. Thomas frowned. A covenant. Locke's eyes were wet. 2 centuries ago, this town was founded by shipwreck survivors, men who bargained with the sea. They promised to give it laughter in exchange for life and the sea. Thomas asked, the sea sent fog instead. It laughs for them. The gaslight flickered, and for a moment, Thomas thought he saw something move behind the pulpit, a pale face, wide-mouthed, watching. Dream contagion by the week's end. No one slept without smiling. The air was heavy with the sound of quiet laughter, muffled, restrained, as though coming from behind the walls. Even animals behaved strangely. Horses refused to enter the streets. Dogs whined at empty rooms, and the gulls, once loud and cruel, had vanished entirely. Thomas began writing shorter entries, his hand increasingly unsteady. Eleanor's cottage empty, Penryn gone. I hear singing through the keyhole. The song has no words. only breath. I think it's him. On July 10th, he dreamt again of the pier. This time, the smiling man spoke. You've written enough. Come and see how it ends. When Thomas woke, the window was open. His notebook lay on the floor, pages damp. Someone had drawn a small, smiling face on the cover in soot. The fog inside that evening, the innkeeper found him standing in the hallway, eyes glassy, murmuring to himself, "Mr. Wren, are you well?" Thomas turned slowly, lips curling slightly, involuntary, almost apologetic. "Do you hear it too?" he asked. "Hear what?" He pointed upward. The fog breathing through the walls. The woman stepped back. Behind him, the wallpaper rippled as if something moved inside it. That night, Grayhaven's lamps flickered one final time, the gaslight turning dim, the air thickening to the point of suffocation. The town slept, and every window smiled. Thomas's last entry, "The fog remembers us now. We are its laughter. When I close my eyes, I see the sea grinning. Tomorrow I go to the shore." Signed, T.W. Chapter 4. The Minister's Confession. Whispered Devotion beneath a dying light. The church bell had not rung for 43 nights. Grayhaven's air was heavy, like soaked velvet. Inside the chapel, the smell of mildew and wax lingered, candles drooping in their holders as though weary from their own dim flame. Reverend Abner Locke knelt before the altar, whispering a prayer he no longer believed in. "Lord, if this is your mist, let me drown in it before it smiles again." His voice cracked. He hadn't slept for days. When he closed his eyes, he saw them, his congregation, sitting in the pews, smiling in silence. Rows of pale faces, all wearing that same impossible grin. Only one thing frightened him more than the fog outside. The fog inside his church. The visitor in the aisle. On the 5th evening of July, Thomas Wren entered through the chapel doors. The hinges moaned like the voice of something waking. "Reverend," Thomas called, "I need answers." Locke turned, his face half hidden in candlelight. "You shouldn't be here, Mr. Wren. The Lord doesn't listen in the fog anymore." Thomas walked forward, notebook in hand. "I'm told you know what's happening, that there's a legend, a covenant." The minister's hand trembled as he lifted his Bible. "Not legend, memory." He motioned for Thomas to follow him toward the vestry, where old ledgers were kept in a chest carved from driftwood. He unlocked it slowly, revealing brittle papers bound with twine and salt-stained corners. "These are the journals of Reverend Josiah Locke," he said softly. "My great-grandfather. He was here when the fog first came." Thomas knelt beside him. "The 1600s. Locke nodded. "A whaling settlement then," they said. "The fog came after a ship returned without its crew. Only the captain survived, laughing, raving about a man in the mist who showed him joy beyond reason. They hung him at the docks, but when his body swung, it smiled. The Covenant of Grayhaven lock opened a thin leather volume. Its ink faded to brown. He read aloud, "We prayed for calm seas." The voice answered from the fog, saying, "Give me your laughter, and the waves shall sleep." So we laughed in the mist as he commanded, and the tide obeyed. He looked at Thomas. "Since then, the fog comes once every century to collect." Thomas swallowed. "Collect what?" "Laughter, souls, whichever smiles first." The Reverend's voice quivered. "Every locksman since Josiah has served here. Each time we've tried to warn them. Each time the fog wins." Thomas took a slow breath. "Then you believe it's happening again?" "I don't believe." Thunder rolled somewhere beyond the coast, dull and distant. Locke's candle flickered, and both men turned toward the chapel's front pews. A girl sat there, pale dress, black ribbon, hair matted with mist. She looked no older than 10. She smiled. Thomas froze. Locke whispered, "She's one of the lost. Don't speak to her." But the girl tilted her head. "We've been waiting, Father Locke. He wants you to finish your sermon." Locke backed away, clutching the crucifix at his chest. "I buried you 3 days ago, Mary." The girl stood, still smiling. "We didn't stay buried, and then she was gone." The fog rolled down the aisle like smoke from an unseen fire. Faith in fractures that night. Locke wrote a confession. It was found later in the church, ink streaked by salt water. "I have failed my flock." The fog does not steal faith. It feeds on it. When we pray, we call to it. I heard it laugh when I said his name. Tomorrow, I will leave the cross at the shore. Let it find me there. He ended the note with a single line, written shakily but deliberate. Smiling is surrender. The bells that rang themselves near dawn, the fog thickened to the consistency of wool. The villagers claimed they heard the church bell ring, slow and uneven, as though struck by invisible hands, but no one approached. By sunrise, the bell had stopped. When the fog finally lifted, the church doors stood open. Reverend Locke's robes were found folded on the altar, perfectly dry. Only one thing remained, a mirror propped against the pulpit. In its reflection, the church was full again, every pew occupied, every face smiling. Thomas's reflection. Thomas returned to his room at the inn, heart pounding. He tried not to look into the mirror above the washstand, but curiosity gnawed at him. He lifted his eyes. For a moment, his reflection smiled back faintly, almost imperceptibly, and then the fog outside the window stirred, as if something unseen had taken a step closer. "He wants you to finish his sermon too," whispered a voice that came from nowhere and everywhere. Thomas turned, but the room was empty. Only the faint echo of laughter drifted through the glass. Chapter 5. The Lost Children of Grayhaven. They play where the fog is thickest, the hollow playground when the fog came thickest. The town's square would vanish first, the statue of Saint Aurelia, the fishmonger's stalls, even the cobblestones gone, dissolved into pale smoke. Yet somehow, laughter still drifted from within, not the laughter of drunks or fools, but of children, high, breathy, distant. It was said that if one followed that laughter long enough, they would never find the children, but the children would find them. A town without cradles. By midsummer, the townsfolk began noticing the absences. At first, just 2 young Michael and Agnes vanished after playing by the shore. Then 5 more, then 9. Doors that once rattled with the sound of little feet now sat silent. Nurseries went dark. Mothers sang to empty beds, their voices trembling between denial and despair. The mayor called it runaways. The fog had driven them to wander, but Reverend Locke's empty church said otherwise, and the laughter, that sweet, echoing laughter, kept returning at dusk, no matter how many prayers were spoken. Thomas's investigation, Thomas Wren, could not ignore the mystery. After Locke's disappearance, his curiosity had turned to obsession. He began interviewing the townsfolk, sketching their accounts by candlelight. One fisherman told him, "The fog ain't just weather. It's the breath of something starved. When it comes close, you can hear it swallow," a widow whispered. "My daughter said she saw her friends inside the fog, smiling. She said they told her it's warm in there." Thomas marked the testimonies in his notebook. On the page, the same word kept appearing, smiling. The whispers of the marsh one evening, drawn by a faint hum. Thomas followed the sound toward the northern marshlands. The fog there was thicker than soup, yellowed by moonlight. Through it, he saw movement, small shapes darting between reeds. Giggling, he hesitated. "Who's there?" The laughter paused, then came a reply in a child's voice. "Do you want to play, mister?" Thomas's breath caught. Michael, Agnes. No answer, just footsteps circling him, light and wet, like bare feet on soaked ground. He reached into the fog, hand trembling. It was cold, then suddenly warm, as though he dipped it into something living. A small hand brushed his fingers, then another, then a dozen. The fog seemed to tighten around him, not like air, but like cloth, wrapping him in unseen limbs. And beneath the laughter came a low hum, rhythmic and wet, like a lullaby hummed underwater. "Stay with us, mister. The fog keeps us happy." He jerked back, gasping, and the warmth disappeared. When he blinked, the shapes were gone. But small footprints trailed away behind him, glowing faintly in the fog, as though lit from beneath the earth. He, widow's tale, at the edge of town, in a shack overgrown with ivy. Thomas found Widow Hensley, one of the few who still spoke of the fog aloud. She was old, blind in one eye, and always humming. "I saw them years ago," she whispered, "when I was a girl. The fog took my brother. He smiled as he went. He said he heard singing from below the ground. Below? Thomas asked. She nodded. There's something under Grayhaven. Always has been. The mines they dug for salt, they go deeper than they should. They say that's where it breathes. She leaned closer, her good eye glinting. They come back as fog, child. The ones who went down, the ones who drowned. Echoes of the dead that night. Thomas dreamt of the children. They stood in a line at the edge of a pit, fog swirling like a cauldron beneath them. Each child held a lantern, but the light came from within their chests. Their mouths smiled, but their eyes were hollow. We're not lost, said one boy. We're just waiting for everyone else. When Thomas awoke, his bedsheet was damp, not with sweat, but with condensation, as though he had been sleeping inside the mist. The lantern at the shore the next morning, a fisherman discovered something strange by the docks. A child's toy boat, carved from driftwood, floating against the tide. Inside it, a note written in a shaky, childish scrawl. The fog said, "It's our turn to make it smile." No one claimed the message. No one dared touch the boat. By noon, it was gone. That evening, the laughter returned, louder this time, nearer. The portrait back at the inn. Thomas opened his notebook to sketch the faces he remembered. But as he drew, he realized something impossible. The smiles were the same. Every face, child or adult, shared the same curve of the mouth, the same unnatural rise of the cheek, as though one hand had shaped them all. He flipped through his pages faster. The faces blurred, and in their distortion, one larger face began to emerge, hidden within the overlapping smiles. A face far too wide, far too knowing. And for the first time, Thomas understood. The fog wasn't haunting the town. It was teaching it to smile. The nursery in the mist that night, as he wrote, the innkeeper's wife knocked at his door, pale and shaking. "Mr. Wren," she said, "it's my daughter. She's sleepwalking straight into the fog." He followed her to the street, heart pounding. The girl stood barefoot, staring into the mist, whispering softly. Thomas bent beside her. "What are you saying?" She smiled faintly. "They're calling me to play." And before he could stop her, she stepped forward and vanished. The air where she'd stood shimmered as though the fog itself exhaled, and from within it came 100 tiny giggles. Chapter 6. The man who laughed without breath. Sometimes the dead forget to stop breathing. The awakening, 2 nights after the widow's warning. A scream split through the quiet streets of Grayhaven. It came from the mortuary. The fog outside was so thick that even the gas lamps burned dull, like candle stubs behind milked glass. Thomas Wren, half asleep, rushed from his lodging with his coat half buttoned. By the time he reached the mortuary steps, half the town had gathered: fishermen, widows, the butcher, even Reverend Locke's old verger, the coroner. Dr. Felix Rollstone stood pale at the door. His spectacles were fogged, his gloves red-stained. He stammered as he spoke. He moved the body. It laughed. The gathered townsfolk recoiled. Rollstone pointed toward the cold room. It was John Marin, the one drowned last week. I was preparing to sew his lips for burial when he shuddered. When I heard him laugh, no breath, no pulse, just the sound. The fog outside pressed against the mortuary windows, almost listening. The body of John Marin Thomas entered. The mortuary smelled of formaldehyde, salt, and something faintly sweet, like rotting lilies. On the table lay Marin, a fisherman, his skin gray-blue, his mouth partly open. Thomas stood beside Dr. Rollstone. "Are you certain it wasn't air escaping the lungs?" he asked. The doctor shook his head. "No air left, Mr. Wren." His chest was hollow. He leaned close to the corpse. But listen, Thomas did. From deep inside Marin's throat came a faint wheezing sound, rising, falling, like a laugh played backward. Rollstone muttered, "It's been hours since he died. The lungs can't." He stopped mid-sentence as Marin's lips twitched. They stretched slowly into a smile. The sound grew louder, and for the first time since he'd arrived in Grayhaven, Thomas Wren felt his courage falter. He stepped back, trembling. The doctor whispered, "Good Lord." The corpse was smiling, not mockingly, not cruelly, but knowingly, like someone remembering a secret. The autopsy that shouldn't have been the next morning, against all sense, Rollstone insisted on performing an autopsy. Thomas, ever the chronicler, remained to record it. When the chest was opened, they found something impossible. The lungs were shriveled like dried kelp, but the vocal cords were wet, pulsing faintly as though still alive. Rollstone gasped. "This tissue, it's regenerating." He leaned closer. The cords shuddered once, then released a sound, a soft, breathless chuckle. The doctor dropped his scalpel. The body convulsed once more and lay still, the smile frozen. Thomas wrote feverishly, "The 6th of August, 1848. The dead of Grayhaven do not decay in silence. The fog gives them back their voices. A new plague within the week. 3 more corpses were reported to have smiled. 1 sailor, 1 infant, and an old woman whose face twisted into a grin moments before burial." The townsfolk began to whisper, not of ghosts, but of contagion. "The fog makes them laugh," they said, "and laughter means it's inside you." Families began boarding windows with wood, burning herbs by their doors, refusing to touch their dead. The laughter continued, faint, echoing beneath the fog, drifting through the graveyard like a breeze made of voices. And when the wind was still, one could swear the fog itself quivered as if amused. Dr. Rollstone's journal one evening. Rollstone came to Thomas's inn, pale and sweating. He carried a small notebook bound in leather, his handwriting jagged from fear. "Read this," he said, sliding it across the table. Inside were drawings of mouths, mouths smiling too wide, mouths without eyes, mouths blooming from fog like flowers of flesh. And beneath each sketch, the same line written over and over: "They are learning to breathe again." Rollstone looked at him, eyes wild. "It's not the bodies, Wren. It's the fog. It's trying to become them. Every time someone dies, it remembers how lungs sound, how laughter feels." He leaned closer. "It's building something out there. It's not done yet." Before Thomas could respond, Rollstone's head jerked sharply. His lips twitched, not in fear, but in the beginnings of a smile. He covered his mouth, shaking. "It's in the air. Don't breathe too deep." Then he fled into the fog. He was never seen again. The Church of Silent Faces. Days later, Thomas found his way to the old church. Inside, rows of parishioners' portraits hung on the walls, long dead, painted centuries ago. Every face was solemn, devout, but tonight the air inside felt heavy, humming. He lit a candle and gasped. Every portrait was smiling. Not a hint of brushwork showed alteration. Yet every mouth bore the same curve, the same lifeless, contented smirk. The fog outside pressed harder against the stained glass. Thomas dropped the candle. As it rolled, its flame illuminated something behind the altar. Footprints, small, wet, leading down to the crypt below. The laughter underground, he followed. The air grew colder with every step, the fog somehow thicker underground. At the end of the stairwell, the crypt opened into a vast chamber filled with open coffins, not empty, but filled with fog. From within each, a faint laugh rose and fell, like wind through hollow pipes, like the sea pretending to be alive. And then, one by one, the corpses began to rise. Their faces were pale, their chests still, but their mouths stretched impossibly wide, each exhaling laughter that carried no breath. Thomas stumbled backward, clutching his crucifix, whispering, "No, no." The laughter grew louder, overlapping, not chaotic, but harmonious, like a choir. And at its center stood something vast, a shadowed shape forming within the mist, human only in suggestion. It looked down at him, its face indistinct but smiling. Then, with a sound like the tide collapsing, everything went dark. The silence after, when Thomas awoke, he was lying in the church nave. The portraits above had returned to their solemn expressions. No laughter, no corpses, no fog within the walls. Only one mark remained, a faint, damp smile traced on the stone floor beside him, drawn in condensation. He rubbed at it. It did not fade, and as he stumbled outside, the fog greeted him softly, and somewhere, impossibly close, someone laughed without breath. Chapter 7: Letters from the Dead. Ink remembers, what the mouth forgets. The arrival 3 days after Dr. Ralstone's disappearance. Thomas Wren returned to his inn with the air of a man trying to think his way out of madness. He had not slept. The candle at his desk had burned down to its brass neck. Outside, the fog lapped against the window like a tide too slow to see but too constant to forget. He meant to write a report to London, something, anything, to tether his mind to the rationale. But as he sorted his papers, he found an envelope resting neatly atop his notebook. No one had been in his room. The door was locked from within. Yet there it lay, pale and damp, addressed in a childish scrawl to Mr. Thomas Wren, Room 3, Grayhaven Inn. No postmark, no seal, only a crude drawing of a smile where the wax should have been. The first letter, he opened it with trembling hands. Dear Mr. Wren, we are happy here. The fog is warm, and it hums like a mother's heart. Agnes, says the man with the long mouth, taught us a song. You will like it, everyone will. We play near the graves now. Come see us when you stop breathing. Love, Michael. Thomas froze. Michael, the boy who'd vanished a month before. The ink was damp, as though written that morning, and beneath the signature, pressed faintly into the paper, was the outline of a small hand, wet, sticky, cold. He burned the letter that night, or tried to. The flames refused to catch. The paper blackened, but did not curl. When he looked again, the writing had returned faintly visible through soot. Don't burn smiles, Mr. Wren. They only spread. The second post by morning. 3 more envelopes had arrived under his door. Each bore a different name. Eleanor Cray, Widow Hensley, and Felix Ralstone. All 3 were dead or missing. He opened the first. Dear Thomas, it's easier once you stop running. The fog shows you what you already wanted. It just takes your breath away first. I painted the fog, and now the fog paints me, Eleanor. He opened the second. The mines weren't dug for salt. They were graves, stacked downward. Every century, the fog wakes to see if we remember. Don't write about it. Words are doors. Widow Hensley. The third was written in the doctor's sharp hand. They opened their mouths to laugh, and something looked out. If you read this, you're already part of it. Fr. The investigator's descent. Thomas's mind frayed at the edges. He began to notice small things, impossible things. The letters multiplied when he turned away. His own handwriting appeared in the margins of his notebook, words he didn't remember writing. It smiles when you think of it. The fog likes the sound of your name. Don't stop writing. He tore the pages out, stuffed them into the fireplace, and watched them smoke. But the smoke rose thick, curling into the faint outline of a face, grinning in the flame. He left the inn and went straight to the postmaster. The postmaster's revelation. The post office sat near the docks. one of the few buildings untouched by fog inside. Old Mr. Greaves ran it, a man so meticulous he ironed his stamps. When Thomas laid the letters before him, Greaves stared, then paled. "I didn't deliver these," he said. "Haven't delivered anything to the inn in weeks. No one sends letters in Grayhaven anymore, not since the children went missing." "Then who?" Greaves shook his head. "They come by themselves. Found them in the box every morning. Same handwriting, same seal. I burned them once." He looked at Thomas with weary eyes. Next day they were back, twice as many. He leaned closer, whispering, "You can't burn what the fog writes. It's already written in air." The song of the dead that night. Thomas sat by his desk, reading every letter he'd collected. There were now 24 in total. Each described a different dream, but all spoke of the same place. A pier stretching into mist, where figures stood waiting, smiling. One letter, unsigned, contained only this line: "When the tide breathes in, we breathe out. When it breathes out, we smile." He heard something then faint, singing outside his window. Children's voices, whispering words he couldn't quite make out. He opened the shutters. The fog stared back, thick and shimmering, and within it, faint silhouettes swayed like lanterns. The melody was soft, rhythmic, and wrong. Each phrase ended in a giggle, a sound too sharp to belong to joy. He backed away, whispering, "Stop." But the song only grew louder, until it became one word, chanted slowly by dozens of voices. "Smile, smile, smile." The letter from himself by morning. There was one last envelope waiting under the door. This one bore his own handwriting. Hands shaking, he opened it. "Dear Thomas, it's easier when you accept that you never left London, that the train stopped in the fog and you stepped out before you should have. Grayhaven isn't a town. It's the breath you took before dying. Keep writing. The fog likes your words. You." He read it 3 times. The ink bled each time he blinked, as though the words were still wet. He felt the fog behind his eyes, now not around him, but inside him, like steam curling through his thoughts. The postmark that shouldn't exist in desperation. Thomas packed the letters into a satchel and rushed back to the docks. He meant to post them, to send them away from Grayhaven, anywhere, to break the pattern. But when he handed them to the courier, the man frowned. "There's already a postmark, sir." He held up the stack. Every envelope bore the same black stamp, dated 2 days ahead. Grayhaven, August 8th, 1848. Delivered after death. The final message that night. Thomas dreamt of writing again, but his hand no longer moved by will. It was guided by the fog itself, curling through his veins like ink. The quill scratched across paper faster than he could think, spelling words he didn't understand, then ending with one slow, deliberate phrase: "The smile is the last breath of God." When he awoke, His hand still clutched the pen. His fingertips were black with soot, his nails cracked, and outside the fog laughed, softly, kindly, almost tenderly. Chapter 8. The Smile That Wouldn't Fade. The dead remember us best when we try to forget them. The church beneath the fog the next morning broke without a sunrise, just a dim silver bruise behind the mist, enough to show the shape of roofs and crosses, but not enough to name a day. Thomas walked the cobblestone street to the old church, guided by the sound of a bell that didn't ring. He had dreamt of it through the night, the bell swinging in slow motion, its clapper replaced by a jawbone, grinning in rhythm. When he arrived, he found the church doors half open, as though expecting him. The interior smelled of damp hymnals and iron, candles guttered without flame, their wax frozen mid-drip. At the altar stood a portrait, a grotesque, life-sized painting covered by dusty glass. Its brass plaque read, Father Calamus Haldane, 1724 to 1768. A priest in heavy robes, smiling so widely it split the corners of his mouth. The eyes were kind, terribly kind, but empty, like hollows that had learned to look alive. The sermon of laughter behind the altar lay stacks of decaying papers, sermons, and notes. Thomas began to read. The ink, though centuries old, seemed fresh, as though the fog itself preserved it. To laugh is to confess, to smile is to kneel. In the curl of the mouth we meet the divine reflection. Another line, when they hanged me for heresy. I smiled so the air would remember, and then, written in red ink, perhaps blood, when my neck broke, the fog rose. It has my breath now. Thomas froze. This was the origin. The condemned priest, Father Haldane, executed for blasphemy and rumor of witchcraft. But his smile, they said, it remained even after death. The body buried in Grayhaven's old cemetery refused decay. The fog had risen that night and never left. He turned to the portrait again. In the weak light, the painted smile appeared slightly wider than before. The grinning choir, a rustle, sounded from behind the pews. He turned and froze. 12 children stood in the aisles, their faces pale, eyes distant. Each one grinned, mouths stretched as if caught mid-laughter, and as they smiled, a thin hum filled the air, a note of unison that made his skull throb. They began to sing, but the melody wasn't words. It was breathing inhalations and exhalations, arranged like a hymn. He backed away, whispering, Michael, Agnes. No answer, only smiles. He ran from the church, out into the blinding white fog. When he looked back, the building was gone, or rather, swallowed. The bell tolled once, distant and low, like laughter through water, the laughing historian. Later that evening, Thomas sought out Lydia Marsh, the town's last surviving historian. Her house stood near the edge of the cliff, its garden full of rusted wind chimes. When he knocked, She opened immediately, as though expecting him. "You've seen it, haven't you?" she said, her voice tremulous. The grin. Thomas nodded, her eyes darkened. "Then it's already remembering you." She led him inside. Her walls were lined with drawings, portraits of people, all smiling unnaturally wide. Some faces he recognized from the missing posters around town. Others seemed ancient, their attire belonging to centuries past. She poured tea, trembling slightly, and began to speak. Father Haldane was hanged for teaching the townsfolk to smile through death. He believed the soul escapes, not through breath, but through laughter. He thought that if one could die smiling, the spirit would linger, friendly, eternal. She looked toward the window, where the fog pressed like wet cloth. But eternity doesn't want company. It only wants reflection. So it borrowed his face. The photograph from a drawer. Lydia produced a faded photograph, one that shouldn't have existed. It showed the church in daylight, years before the fog swallowed it. A funeral procession. But in the background, high in the bell tower, a man stood, unmistakable, even in blur, grinning. "Taken in 1904, she said, "long after he died." Some say the fog keeps his image alive. Thomas felt cold rise up his spine. The figure in the tower wasn't painted or faded. It was recently added. The edges were too sharp, the grin too deliberate, and behind him, faintly visible in the mist, were 12 smaller smiles. The dreaming mirror that night. He dreamed again, or so he thought. He was back in his room at the inn, writing, as always. But when he looked up, the mirror above the desk rippled like water. Behind his reflection stood Father Haldane, smiling, whispering something Thomas couldn't hear. The reflection began to grin wider than he could physically manage. He touched his lips in panic and found them moving, stretching without command. It hurt. He tried to scream, but only laughter came out dry, breathless, endless. He woke, gasping, face wet, jaw aching. In the mirror, his reflection wasn't smiling, it was watching. And behind it, faint fog, curling like fingers. The visit unable to sleep, Thomas wandered the streets until dawn. He found himself back near the docks, where the fog was thickest. A figure stood there, Lydia Marsh, only she wasn't moving. Her face was turned toward the sea, smiling too wide for her cheeks. Her eyes were open, unblinking, filled with mist. He touched her shoulder. The body collapsed, light as air. Only fog spilled out. On the ground, written in chalk, were her last words. "The fog remembers what we forget." The voice in the fog as he staggered backward. A whisper followed him, not spoken, but breathed. "Smile for me, Thomas." The fog rippled outward, forming the faint outline of a human face, vast and grinning, the mouth stretching from one side of the street to the other. He fell to his knees, trembling, muttering prayers that came out as laughter, and through his own voice, the the fog echoed back. Laughter is the gate. He stumbled back to the inn, locked himself inside, and smashed the mirror. The note in the broken glass amid the shards, he saw something glinting, a scrap of paper that hadn't been there before, written in elegant, dark ink. You smiled once when you were born. You'll smile again when you return. C.H. He realized what the initials meant. Calamus Haldane. Outside, the church bell rang again, though no church remained. The smile that wouldn't fade. He sat by candlelight, staring into the broken mirror fragments. Each shard reflected a different version of his face, all smiling. He touched his lips. They trembled, resisting, then stretched upward against his will. He tried to shout, to command himself, but the air bent around his voice, twisting it into laughter. The fog began to pour through the cracks of the window again, slow, deliberate, whispering with every breath, "We remember you." Thomas Wren, journalist of London, began to laugh without sound, his face fixed forever in that perfect, lifeless grin. Chapter 9. Through the mirror of the mist, there comes a moment when the fog no longer hides the world. It shows it as it truly is, the reflection that breathed for 3 nights after Lydia's disappearance. Thomas Wren barricaded himself in his rented room at the inn. He had broken the mirror, sealed the windows with wax paper, and burned every journal entry that mentioned the word smile. But fog is patient. It seeps through seams, soft as breath, invisible until it touches your skin. On the 3rd night, he woke to the sound of gentle laughter, his own laughter, echoing from the wall where the mirror once hung. A shimmer of mist clung to the plaster, shaping itself into a faint silver reflection. It moved when he moved, but slightly slower, as though it were remembering him, not mirroring him. When he leaned closer, he saw it inhale. His reflection was breathing. He stumbled back, knocking over the candle. The flame wavered, caught the air, and flared bright enough to reveal what was hidden. There were others in the reflection. Dozens of faint faces behind his, all smiling, all watching. He whispered, "Who are you?" And the fog answered softly, "We are what remains when laughter runs out." The mirror in the well at dawn. Desperate to flee, Thomas followed the path toward Grayhaven's outskirts. He had heard there was an old well, one that predated the church itself, dug when the settlement was first founded. The villagers whispered that if you looked into it on a foggy morning, you wouldn't see your reflection. You'd see who owned it. The well sat alone in a sunken courtyard, surrounded by leaning gravestones. He knelt beside it and looked in. There was no water, only fog, swirling slowly, like breath trapped underground. He spoke aloud, trembling, "Father Haldane, show yourself." For a moment, nothing. Then the fog within the well shifted, forming faint, concentric circles, as though something below had laughed. The reflection of the fog became a face, not smiling now, but solemn, disappointed. And then it spoke. You wanted the truth. But truth, Thomas, only smiles when it's alone. He gasped. What are you? A mirror that learned to dream. He stumbled backward, his boots scraping the cobblestones. The fog rose from the well, following him like a tide, whispering his own words back to him, every sentence he had ever written twisted into mockery. Grayhaven, a town cloaked in silence, fog that breathes, a smile that never fades. It was reading his journal aloud from inside his mind. The return to the church that evening. Driven by the need to end it, Thomas returned to the ruins of the church. The building now stood half-sunken in mist, the bell tower little more than a silhouette. Inside, he found the portrait of Father Haldane shattered, the glass melted, the canvas rippling as though still wet. In its place stood a mirror, tall, cracked, its surface fogged from within. He felt drawn toward it, not by curiosity, but by gravity. When he looked in, he saw not himself, but the entire town reflected back. The streets, the harbor, the cliffs, all empty. Yet in every window, in every pane of glass, a face smiled. Hundreds of them, thousands, all with the same mouth, all with the same joyless, eternal grin. The mirror whispered, not in words, but in memory. They smiled to survive. Now they survive to smile. The journal of Calamus Haldane in the mirror's reflection. Something shimmered. A book lying beneath the altar. Thomas reached for it, and his fingers touched leather that pulsed faintly as though breathing. It was the lost journal of Calamus Haldane. The entries began, sane enough, prayers, reflections on sin, hope, and faith. Then they grew, fervent. God smiles in storms. I saw him in the fog. His grin was wider than the world. To smile through death is to inherit his likeness. Then came a final passage, written in trembling strokes. I carved the fog from the air with my breath. I taught it to remember joy, but it only learned hunger. Now it seeks faces to keep itself warm. C.H. Thomas closed the book, heart pounding. He finally understood. The fog wasn't evil. It was lonely. It wanted company, a face to reflect, a smile to wear. And Father Haldane had given it his own. The faces in the mist he turned back toward the mirror. The fog behind the glass was alive, rippling like 1,000 veils. Then, one by one, faces began to press outward from its surface. First Lydia, then Michael, then the 12 children. Each smiled, not in horror, but in eerie serenity, as though death had taught them peace. They whispered together, "Smile for us. The mist remembers you." Thomas raised the book like a shield. "I won't join you." The fog laughed, a soft, dry sound like breath against glass. "You already have." He looked down. His reflection in the mirror smiled independently of him. Then, slowly, it reached outward. The shattering with a cry, Thomas hurled the journal at the mirror. The glass exploded inwards, shards spinning like cold rain. Fog burst from within, thick and choking, filling the church like a lung exhaling centuries of silence. He stumbled toward the doorway, coughing, half blind. Behind him, the fragments of mirror continued to hum. Each shard reflected a different world. Grayhaven in sunlight, Grayhaven in snow, Grayhaven under black skies. But in all of them, he saw himself smiling. The fog swirled violently, as though alive with thought. It whispered one final time, almost tenderly, "There's no leaving the reflection, Thomas. You made us visible." And then it receded, flowing back into the cracks of the broken glass, leaving him alone in the cold, silent nave. The bell tolled once more, low, hollow, final. The empty frame when dawn came, the fog thinned for the first time in generations. The villagers found the church doors open, the air clear. Inside lay the shattered remains of a mirror and nothing else. No Thomas, no book, no footprints leading out. But above the altar, where the mirror once hung, a new painting had appeared overnight. It showed a man in a tattered coat, holding a pen, smiling faintly. The plaque beneath read, "Thomas Wren, 1889 to 1923. He wrote joy." Chapter 10, The Last Laugh of Grayhaven. Every echo is a laugh too far away to reach. The day the fog lifted, they said it happened at dawn, though no one could say for sure. Grayhaven woke to a silence so deep it felt physical, as if the entire town was holding its breath. For the first time in living memory, the fog was gone. The sea beyond the cliffs glimmered pale blue. The sun returned, hesitant but visible, like a guest unsure of its welcome. The surviving villagers, what few remains, stepped out into the light. They blinked, shielding their eyes, marveling at the clarity. Yet even as the sunlight touched their faces, none of them smiled. They had forgotten how. The air smelled of salt and iron, the remnants of centuries of damp mist. Birds circled overhead, uncertain, as if searching for something that had been erased. And somewhere, deep below the church ruins, the faint sound of dripping water echoed, rhythmic, almost like laughter. The investigator. 3 days later, a London investigator arrived, Inspector Daniel Croft, dispatched by the Royal Society of Folklore Studies. He had come to document what had been described in telegrams as a collective hallucination of meteorological nature. But as he stepped into Grayhaven, notebook in hand, the first thing he noticed was the smell. Not decay, not quite, but sweetness, faint and wrong, like sugar left too long in the damp. He found the town nearly deserted. The inn was empty, but set for guests, tables arranged as though awaiting return. The church was open to the sky, its bell melted, its pews warped, and in the center of the altar wall hung a new portrait, the one of Thomas Wren, painted in perfect, lifelike detail. Croft frowned. "Curious," he murmured. The artist had a remarkable grasp of shadow. Then he stepped closer and noticed that the eyes in the painting followed him. The smiling sound that night, Croft stayed in the inn. He wrote in his journal by lamplight, detailing his findings, his skepticism, his theories about the fog psychosis afflicting Grayhaven. But as he wrote, a faint noise broke the silence, a kind of breathing giggle. He turned toward the mirror opposite the bed. It was cracked, 6 fractures radiating from a single point, and in each segment of the glass, his reflection smiled differently, one kindly, one mockingly, one with tears in its eyes. Croft rubbed his face. He wasn't smiling, but the mirror thought he was. He covered it with a towel and returned to his notes, forcing reason into his thoughts. Visual fatigue, suggestive atmosphere, no evidence of the supernatural. He closed the notebook, but before he could blow out the lamp, a whisper came from beneath the towel. "We remember you." The journal in the sea at dawn. A storm rolled in, sudden, without warning. Waves battered the cliffs, and the tide rose unnaturally high. Villagers fled inland, shouting that the sea was laughing. Croft, driven by duty, or perhaps by a darker curiosity, made his way to the shoreline. There, half buried in seaweed and sand, he found something impossible, a leather-bound book, its pages unspoiled despite the salt water. The cover bore the initials TW. He opened it carefully. Inside were notes, sketches, and transcriptions of sermons by Father Calamus Haldane. But midway through, the handwriting shifted from Wren's to something else, firmer, older. A line in black ink read, "He gave me his voice. I gave him the smile." CH, as Croft read, the sea grew louder, not with wind, but with overlapping laughter. It came from below the waves, deep and steady, as though something vast was remembering joy. The return of the fog. By evening, the storm passed. The sky was clear again for a moment. Then, from the direction of the sea, mist began to form once more. But this fog was different. It didn't roll. It rose like breath from 1,000 unseen mouths. Croft ran back toward town, shouting warnings, but no one answered. The streets were empty, windows dark, and in every pane of glass, a single smile waited, faint, familiar, and patient. He stumbled into the church again, desperate for shelter. The portrait of Thomas Wren was gone. In its place stood the mirror hole, shining and clear, and within it he saw Grayhaven underwater roofs, half sunken, streets rippling with reflected faces. The fog above was only the breath of what slept below. Then he saw himself in the reflection, standing at the altar, smiling faintly. He blinked. His reflection didn't. The last laugh, the mirror shimmered, and from its surface, something pressed outward, fingertips, pale and dripping. A voice whispered, You came to study us. You stayed to remember us. Croft stepped back, but the reflection followed, walking through the glass like a man through smoke. It stopped an inch from his face, smiling Thomas Wren's smile. Say it, Daniel. Say the word that binds all memory, he whispered, trembling. Smile. And the fog laughed. It poured out of the church, down the streets, over the cliffs, spreading into the sea, and as it touched the water, it reflected perfectly, like the world itself had grinned. The letter found years later. In 1934, a salvage diver exploring the wrecks off Grayhaven's coast found a sealed jar embedded in coral. Inside was a letter, the ink faded but legible. To whoever reads this, the fog was never weather, it was breath. The laughter was memory. We built a town upon a reflection, and it remembered us better than we remembered ourselves. Thomas Wren, somewhere between the air and the sea. The diver looked up from the note. Through his helmet, the sea around him was gray, thick with drifting silt. Something brushed past him, soft like a hand. When he turned, a dozen faces floated in the water, all smiling silently. He tried to scream, but only bubbles escaped, and one of them laughed. Epilogue: the calm after the smile today. Grayhaven no longer appears on maps. The coastline has eroded, the harbor reclaimed by sea and silt. But on nights when the fog rolls in from the north, fishermen swear they see lights beneath the waves, a faint golden glow like candles in sunken windows. And sometimes, when the sea is perfectly still, they hear it, a distant, rolling laugh that never quite fades. Not cruel, not kind, simply remembering. The fog has returned to where it belongs, between the sea and the silence. No maps carry its name now, no prayers mention its people. But sometimes, in that hush before dawn, when the world itself seems to hold its breath, you might feel it, a warmth in the mist, like an unseen smile watching over the dark. Grayhaven sleeps beneath the tide, and the laughter it left behind drifts softly through the waves. Not cruel, not mocking, just remembering. So, if one night you walk alone and the fog greets you like an old friend, don't be afraid to smile back. It's only Grayhaven whispering good night from Grayhaven. And may your dreams be clear until the fog returns. The journey doesn't end here. A gentle, ambient soundscape now carries you further into serenity, wrapping you in soft melodies and soothing whispers, guiding your mind and body into deep, restful sleep.